Hey everybody, this is Dr. Moore, and this video is about special species in ecosystems. We're going to be focusing on two different kinds of special species in ecosystems. The first are keystone species, and the second are indicator species. Let's start with keystone species. A keystone species is a species with a significant role in its ecosystem, especially relative to its population size. So really big impact, but not necessarily a really big population. Another way you can think about keystone species is this. If a keystone species is removed from an ecosystem, the ecosystem changes dramatically. And the poster child of keystone species is the sea otter. The sea otter is a marine mammal and it eats sea urchins. And sea urchins are animals that eat kelp. Kelp is an algae that grows in thick forests, like off the Alaskan coast, and it supports a really biodiverse community of species: snails, fish, crabs, you name it. Now, sea otters are keystone species because if we remove sea otters, say by hunting them for their super soft fur, we find that the sea urchin population proliferates. And now there's all of these sea urchins, they are going to eat the kelp. And when they eat the kelp disappears along with all of the organisms that depend on the kelp and the kelp forest for their habitat. That's what makes the sea otter a keystone species, because its presence and its absence completely changes the ecosystem. With sea otters, you get these lush, verdant kelp forests, and without sea otters, the sea urchin population explodes, increases in number, and the kelp get defoliated, and the organisms that live in the kelp are no longer able to survive. A lot of keystone species are top predators, like the sea otter, but it's not necessary. Beavers are a good example of a keystone species that's an herbivore. So the way that beavers are a keystone species, they can completely change the ecosystem that they're in. A stream without beavers will be a swift-moving stream and pretty homogeneous all the way down. But if a beaver family moves in, they're going to build a dam across the stream, and that's going to create these slow-moving wetlands behind the dam. In other words, they have introduced a whole new habitat to this ecosystem, and all of the organisms that depend on this kind of habitat are going to survive in an ecosystem with beavers, but not in an ecosystem without beavers. If you're wondering why we call these species keystone species, it's a metaphor that we're borrowing from architecture. In architecture, the keystone is that top wedge-shaped stone in an arch. It's the last stone to go in, and it's the stone that holds the whole structure together. So if you take this stone out, the keystone out, the whole arch collapses. A keystone species is the same idea. It's one little piece, but if you take it out, the whole structure of the ecosystem changes. The second kind of special species we'll discuss today are indicator species. An indicator species is a species that reveals information about an ecosystem to humans, to us as researchers. And a really good and important example of indicator species are benthic macroinvertebrates. What? So benthic means bottom, macro means big, and invertebrates are animals without backbones. So we're talking about large-ish creatures that live at the bottom of creeks, and they don't have backbones. So they are insects and snails and other kinds of invertebrates. And the cool thing about benthic macroinvertebrates is that we can use them to tell us how polluted a stream is. So some benthic macroinvertebrates, like caddisflies, mayflies, stoneflies, and water pennies, are very sensitive to pollution. And so if you find a lot of these guys in your sample, that tells you that your water quality is pretty good. On the other hand, there are benthic macroinvertebrates like blackfly larvae, leeches, midge larvae, and pouch snails, and these are very tolerant of pollution. So if you find a lot of these and not so much of the other species, that's an indication that that stream is pretty polluted. And so that concludes my video on keystone and indicator species.